Welcome to the story of Esther. You can find the book of Esther in the Bible just after the book of Judith and just before the first book of Maccabees. One person in this story who may appear somewhat humorous because of his peculiar decisions is the king of Persia, otherwise known as the king of Babylon. His name is Ahasuerus. This is probably a fictional name for a fictional person, but he is presumed to be modeled after the real king Xerxes I, who ruled from 486 to 465 BC. I'm taking the dates of that reign as the time period of this story. The Jews were not exiles or slaves in Persia at that time. This was more than 100 years after Nebuchadnezzar had virtually destroyed Jerusalem and taken most of the Jews into bondage. A later ruler of Persia, Cyrus II, had released the Jews to return to Judea and had helped them with the rebuilding of the temple. King Xerxes I, hereinafter known as Ahasuerus, came after Cyrus. So the Jews then in Persia were not slaves, but they were not loved by the Persians either. Both Mordecai and Esther in this story did not advertise the fact that they were Jewish. Funny thing, isn't it? Modern day Persians, that is, Iranians, and modern day Judeans, that is, Israelis, are still not very friendly with each other. Other characters in this story include Vashti, who begins as the wife of the king. It is difficult to call her the queen. We'll see why. Mordecai, who is a Jew. As the story begins, Esther's two parents have died, and Mordecai, a relative, has taken on Esther as her foster father, an adoptive parent, if you will. Mordecai and Esther are very close. Also, there are two eunuchs who serve the king, named Bigthan and Teresh. They will appear near the beginning of the story. Also, there's a person named Haman who has been promoted to a very high rank by the king. We're going to hear about what Haman does. So, and of course, also there's Esther, who's a young and beautiful Jewish girl. The story is associated with a major Jewish festival. It's a festival called Purim. It's a 2-day festival, and it celebrates the survival of the Jewish people from a serious threat of annihilation. Two small footnotes. The first, to preserve the good name of the real King Xerxes. The real King Xerxes had only one wife, and her name was Amestris. A second footnote is that there is an actual tomb in the city of Hamadan, which is believed by many to hold the remains of Mordecai and Esther, and it has been the subject of some news recently. More about that later. Now, on to the story of Esther. Let's get into it. King Ahasuerus was the ruler of half the world. He ruled over 127 provinces in his kingdom, and he liked to throw parties. He threw parties for everything. When he threw a party, it would be a festival that could last for an entire year. He would invite important people from his land and keep them very well fed and very well watered for a very long time. During the course of one of these parties, his queen Vashti also threw a slightly less ambitious party for the women. When the king's party was nearing an end, Ahasuerus decided that he wanted to show off his queen to his own drunken guests. He ordered her to come and stand before him and his company. She refused to do this. Why would she refuse to appear before the king? Well, I have a feeling it's because he had some things in mind for her to do that she was not willing to do in front of all these men. But that's just a guess. The king was infuriated with Vashti for her disobedience. He was so infuriated that he roared, "You're not my queen anymore. You're nothing to me now. You're banished. You're gone. I will choose a new queen." That's all there was to it. Whatever the king said was law. So he was going to pick a new queen. So you want to know how he did this? How did the king choose a new queen? Well, he had a very elaborate procedure. He gathered the most beautiful maidens in all 127 provinces of his kingdom, and he set them on a vigorous 1-year training program. In that year, each candidate would take a bath every day. After the bath, she would be rubbed down with cosmetics and perfume so that her whole body would radiate cleanliness and marvelous aroma. Only then, after a year of this, would she be fit to stand before the king. And only then would he choose his queen from this group. As an aside, the best perfumes they used in those days were myrrh and spikenard. Spikenard, by the way, was the flavor in the oil that one of the women rubbed on Jesus' feet in the house of Lazarus in the New Testament. It's also the flavor in the oil today that is rubbed on the head of a baby in Catholic baptisms. That's spikenard. Myrrh was a gift that one of the wise men presented to baby Jesus in Bethlehem. In our Bible class, I passed around some bars of handmade soap with these flavors, and it was might even nice to smell. Mordecai held a high position in the court, and he was able to arrange for Esther to be one of the maidens who would go through the year-long preparation for presentation to the king. Now, let's not forget, Mordecai and Esther were both Jewish. And remember, Jews were not held in high regard in Persia. Both Esther and Mordecai realized that it was prudent to hide their Jewishness as much as they could. So, when the time came around for all the sweet-smelling maidens to be presented to the king, there was no contest. Esther dazzled King Ahasuerus with her beauty, her charm, and her intelligence, and she became the new queen, Queen Esther. Still didn't know she was Jewish. Shortly after Esther became queen, however, Mordecai happened to come across a plot against the king. The story of that discovery is told in chapter 2 of the Book of Esther, and I'm going to read an excerpt from it. So this is from the Book of Esther, chapter 2, and it's verses 21 to 23. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told it to the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, both the men were hanged on the gallows. It was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. That's straight out of the Bible. So there was another person in the king's court whose name was Haman, who rose to great authority with the king. The king promoted Haman to the second highest position in all 127 provinces of Persia, otherwise known as Babylon. Haman took this promotion and his new power very seriously. He insisted that everyone he met must bow to him, and everywhere he went, everyone did. Everyone except for Mordecai. Mordecai refused to bow and scrape before Haman. Mordecai said bluntly, "I will only bow to God and you're not God. I will not bow to you. That story is also well told in the book of Esther in chapter 3 of the book of Esther. And I'm going to read a passage here in the words of the Bible from that chapter. So this is Esther chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, and I've taken the liberty of abbreviating it a little bit. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman and set his seat above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and did obeisance to Haman. But Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" When they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance to him, Haman was infuriated. But he thought it was beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, all the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Well, that's pretty serious. But Haman went to King Ahasuerus, and he told the king that these Jewish people are terrible. They don't bow down to me. They won't bow down to you. They don't respect you. They're bad citizens in your domain. You need to get rid of them. Well, since the king thought so highly of Haman, and since he had recently promoted him, he responded, okay, let's get rid of all the Jews. How do you think we ought to do it? When do you think we ought to do it? Haman told the king that he should issue a proclamation calling for all loyal citizens of the kingdom to kill all the Jews they could find. The king agreed to do this. The king only had one problem associated with preparing a proclamation to this effect. He needed to pick a specific day when they would kill all these Jews. After spending a little time in kingly thought, here is how he chose the day when all the Jews should be exterminated. He had some stones with numbers on them that were used for gambling games in his kingdom. They're something like dice. You'd throw them on the ground and read the numbers that came up. Except they didn't call these dice, they called them peer. Talk about casual arrogance. The king decided that he'd throw two stones. The first stone would tell him 1 month in the Jewish calendar it would be, and the second stone would tell him the day it would be. And by that scientific knowledge, the king set the date for killing all the Jews as the 12th month and the 13th day. That would make it the 13th day of the month of Adar in the Jewish calendar. So he sent that out as a proclamation to all 127 provinces. At this point, Esther is now Queen Esther, and she is horrified by the consequences of this proclamation from the king. She goes to the king and lets him know that she is loyal, but she is also Jewish. And the king responds flippantly, "Oh, don't worry. As queen, you're exempt from this proclamation. No problem. Nobody's going to hurt you. It's only the rest of the Jewish people that will be slaughtered, every single one of them, but not you." What to do? Well, in response, Esther tells the king, "You remember there was a plot to assassinate you, framed by two eunuchs, and you were saved from that assassination because a Jew, Mordecai, came to me to tell you about that plot. You had those eunuchs and their other conspirators executed, and that saved your life. Don't you think that shows loyalty? The Jews are good and loyal to you. It's a bad man who tells you that they aren't." After thinking about Esther's words, the king agrees it it would be better not to have all those Jews executed on the 13th day of Adar. So Esther then asks him, so revoke your proclamation. But the king replies, oh no, I can't revoke the proclamation. Once an edict has been given by the king, and that's me, it can never be revoked. The king's word is law, and it's never changed. Not even by the king, not even by the king. What a brilliant king. You gotta love that. Well, to get around this king's fuzzy way of thinking, Esther decided to have a very small banquet that would be attended by only the king and Haman and by Esther. She convinces the king to ask Haman for his advice on what kind of gift he should give to someone who has saved his life. The banquet occurs, and the king asks Haman this question. Haman believes that the king is speaking about him, and that the king wants to honor him, and that he is being invited to ask for the most lavish gift he can imagine for himself. So Haman tells the king that he should give his lifesaver royal robes that the king himself has worn, and a fine horse that the king himself has ridden. And in response, the king tells Haman that these gifts shall be given to Mordecai, since Mordecai is the one who saved his life. Uh-oh, at that point, Haman realizes that he has lost favor with the king. Esther then accuses Haman of convincing the king to annihilate the Jewish people, who are in fact his loyal subjects. It's not looking good for Haman. The upshot is that the king orders the execution of Haman, and Haman's house ordered to be given to Mordecai. However, of course, the king is still stuck with the fact that he has this proclamation. He's issued a rule that all his constituents should rise up against the Jews and kill them on the 13th day of Adar. What a puzzle for this king. Oh my. In order to make things right, at least in the king's mind, the king decides he issues a new proclamation. This one says that the Jewish people are really his loyal subjects, and that if anyone tries to kill any Jews on the 13th day of Adar, all the citizens should rise up to defend the Jews. So now there are two commands from the king. One, to kill all the Jews, and the other, to defend the Jews against anybody who tries to kill them. Brilliant, no? What actually happened on the appointed day was that there was something of a civil war in all 127 provinces of the kingdom. At the end of the day, 75,000 Persians lay dead at the hands of the Jews, and assisted by the huge number of citizens who helped the Jews. The kingdom is saved. The Jews are saved from annihilation. All is well. After the day of slaughter, the next 2 days are spent in celebration. Okay. And that's where the celebration of Purim, otherwise known as the Festival of Lots, comes from. This festival is still celebrated today by Jewish people around the world, and it's still a 2-day celebration. The next day of Purim will be March 2nd and 3rd, 2026. The name Purim is simply the plural form of pir, the dice-like stones rolled by the king to determine which day to annihilate the Jews. One extra piece to note about the Jewish victory that resulted in this death of 75,000 Persians. When the Jews killed those Persians, they did not plunder their livestock or their possessions. They bound themselves to a guideline expressed in the first book of Samuel to the effect that defending yourself against your enemies was enough. The Lord would not be pleased if you profited from it. But that's another story. We can tell that at another time. Another note, though, that brings us to modern days. There's a tomb in Hamadan, which I talked about at the start of this talk. It's in western Iran, which many believe contains the remains of both Mordecai and Esther, and it's a tourist attraction. During the last few years, as the war in Gaza has progressed, this tomb has been trashed several times by certain Iranians as a protest against the Israelis. These protesters are clearly unhappy about a tourist attraction that celebrates the slaughter of 75,000 of their ancestors, the Persians. Even here, however, there's a bit of a problem in that this particular tomb was apparently built in the 16th century AD. And that's about 2,500 years after Esther's time. And that's the story of Esther. Thank you so much for watching.